Good evening, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. So this is part of our Byzantine School, the Byzantine School Part 5. So this is Erasmus, Henry VIII, and the Monastic Purge, what they didn't tell you. And so oftentimes we're dealing with fragmentary evidence when we're talking about certain readings in the Bible. We're talking about, even certain TR readings. James White will make much ado about this and talk about Ephesians 3:9 and say, well, we've only got, at first he said there were no manuscripts with that reading. And then, it came out, there was one with it, and then there was two with it. And the more that we looked at it, we just found, quite a few. But this is how critical text people are trained. They're trained to basically say that what we have today is pretty much a representation of what we've always had in the manuscript form is what I'm talking about. And so oftentimes you'll get people in the majority text movement and they'll say, well, we've got, 45% say this and 55% say that. So we're going to go with this reading. But is this an accurate figure? Now, we're looking at the Byzantine school. So the Byzantine school was what Erasmus was a part of. So when he was living with Aldus Manutius in Venice, he was a proofreader for him in his scriptorium. Basically, they were printing Greek works. And so he was a proofreader there, going through Greek material. And he was surrounded by native Greek-speaking people who had been from Constantinople and other places. And so Venice had about 5,000 Greek people living there at the time. So there's lots of Greeks. And so Erasmus actually went there to learn Greek. Specifically, he went there to learn the correct pronunciation of Greek. Now, I know today people will say, well, I learned Erasmerian Greek, and that's why I speak with an American twang when I speak my Greek. Well, that's usually just an Americanization. Erasmus actually spoke modern Greek with the modern Greeks. It was Reuchlin who developed a language system so that you could speak Greek as they spoke it back in the Koine period. So that's what people are trying to say Erasmus did, but Erasmus actually spoke modern Greek. And so basically the modern Greek era is from the fall of Constantinople in 1453 when the Muslims went into what's known as modern-day Turkey and Istanbul today. That was known as the Byzantine area, and that was Constantinople. So Erasmus traveled quite frequently around Europe. He traveled to England, and so a lot of people don't realize that he spent quite a bit of time in the UK. Rotterdam is only a stone's throw away from the UK, and so we see that he spent time in Venice, he spent time in Rome, he spent time in Basel, in Switzerland. He spent time also in the UK. So we're going to look at all this and how this plays out with the destruction of manuscripts. Now, here we have a picture. Now, obviously, this is AI generated. I'm loving these AI generated pictures for my thumbnails to do with YouTube videos and things like that. They're just, I just typed in the prompt, Henry VIII, with the destruction of manuscripts that happened when the monasteries were destroyed or something, irregular like that. And it just came up with this picture. It's pretty amazing. That would make a book cover, it's just so amazing. But what we see is Henry VIII, what he did, he purged the monasteries. And so we're going to go through that history because a lot of people don't realize this happened. And many manuscripts went walkabout. And so oftentimes what you hear is, we have so many more manuscripts now than Erasmus had, or Beza, and so many of these other people. I want to show you that Erasmus and Tyndale and people who were before the Purge had access to so many more manuscripts, because so many got destroyed in England around this time. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. Now, one of the things is I was looking at the sack of Rome. Now, I'm not talking about the sack of Rome that happened, I think it was in the 4th century, but we're talking about the sack of Rome that happened in 1527. Now, my last Byzantine school video was on that, and we were talking about how in 1527, Rome was basically invaded by the Spanish and the Lutherans. Obviously, when we're saying Lutherans, it's a loose term just to sort of cover bases, because I don't think, it was condoned by Luther, or, people who were Lutheran were usually, pacifistic. I might be wrong on that, but that's my take on it. But they sacked Rome. They went into Rome for quite a while, and there were up to 10,000 deaths. There were multiple manuscripts destroyed, burnt, people just using the manuscripts for their own uses, for fire. Because, I mean, if you're looting a place and you're there for weeks and weeks on end, you need fire, you need to cook food, you need all sorts of things. And so bodies were piled up in the streets, manuscripts were just being looted, stolen, and obviously, if people stash a bunch of manuscripts somewhere and they die, because some of the conflicting party kills them, because there were so many different people in Rome at that time, then those manuscripts just disappear. So the people who had access to those manuscripts before this happened obviously had a broader understanding of what was going on. Rome was the hub of the Renaissance. It had gone on in Florence, Genoa, Venice, but Rome was the hub where even a lot of these popes were Medicis. The Medicis were the international bankers, filthy rich. Obviously, Martin Luther had his beef with the popes, trying to bring indulgences in and this type of thing. But the amount of money and wealth that they had was astronomical. And so they were able to buy artwork that, you just go to the Vatican and have a look, and a lot of these churches around the place, the amount of money that was getting thrown at these churches. So they were able to buy, manuscripts. They were able to, get works of art and things that were basically fueling the Renaissance, or Rome was the hub for the Renaissance. So in 1527, when Rome is sacked, obviously, well, if you just look at the history books, their period of being the hub of the Renaissance finished in 1527, because so much was destroyed, and they never fully recovered from that. And so what we're going to see is in England, there was a similar type of experience. And this wasn't long after. Now, obviously, what I'm going to be showing you guys is that people who had access to manuscripts in the UK, they, and then a lot of these manuscripts have just completely disappeared. Obviously, they have access to manuscripts that we will never know what they were. They're going to have access to readings that we probably have never seen, to variants that we, unless they're written down by these people or printed by these people, they've just disappeared in history. And so this has got to be taken into consideration, because what I find is in the academy, they're constantly pushing that we have to deal with the fragmentary evidence that we have in our hands today. But that's a poor representation of what they had back then, because it's a bit like when you're looking at World War II history. I mean, people might find a helmet or a dagger or things like that. I mean, that's only, 70, 80 years ago. And we see a lot of these things have been destroyed. So unless there's archives and lists and things like that show you what was there. Sometimes people can even go to a battlefield and things are just in such such disarray that they're rotting, they're rusting, they're getting destroyed. I've seen a lot of American World War II machinery in Papua New Guinea, because when they were fighting against the Japanese in Bougainville and Port Moresby and many other places, the only things that are really pristine are things under the ocean, because they keep under there. But anything on land, it's pretty much just a pile of rust now. It's just rotted through. Now, some of these tanks were really thick, and so they're going to last for a while. But you think of books, manuscripts, these things just, sometimes they're so old, people just touch them and they just dissolve. I remember a friend of mine, he was painting Weary Dunlop's house in Melbourne. He's quite a famous Australian. And he said they went to move the curtains and he touched them and they just fell to dust, the curtains. And he said they couldn't even touch them. They had to just paint around them. And so, that was curtains probably put up in Weary Dunlop's life. And, he's passed away a while ago. But it just shows you things are just decaying. They're being destroyed all the time. And one thing that is a huge hole in the manuscript preservation tradition, I guess you'd call it, is the 850 monasteries that were dissolved in England. And so I've been looking into this lately, watching a few videos on this, and I think what I say tonight will really help you understand what Erasmus had access to, and what the churches had access to back then, and how much was lost. Because they don't tell you how much was lost. They just say things like, well, Erasmus only had access to this, this, and that. Well, Beza, he had a few little bits here and there. But when you look into just the monasteries being destroyed, the amount of manuscripts just in England at this time, and we're not even talking about later on in the Great Fire of London, 1666, there were 437 acres of London that just raged for weeks. The Guildford Hall Museum that had all the King James Bible documentation in there just went up in smoke, flames, was destroyed. So that's why we're sort of trying to piece together a lot of this information about the King James Bible. I know a lot of people go to the Bodleian, text of 1602, the bishops, but it's been pointed out by a few people that that could have been written after 1611. And so we're sort of still like shuffling around things and going, well, I'm not really sure what this is. Yes, we have some notes, John Boyce, we have like the Bod 1602, but oftentimes it doesn't just say, well, this is exactly what they did. I know some people confidently affirm that the King James is filled with errors and, all this other stuff, or the committee were fighting over readings. It's just, it's kind of ridiculous when you listen to these people. So what happened in this period of time? So I'll just give you a quick rundown and then we'll go into all the details. So there were 850 monasteries dissolved in England and Wales and throughout the area that is commonly known as United Kingdom today. So obviously the United Kingdom was steeped in Catholicism. They believed in strange doctrines like purgatory. They would pray for your dead family, who most people believe that their family were members who had passed away were in purgatory. So these monks who were in these monasteries, they were constantly praying. So people love these guys. They're doing a good work according to the community, because most people were steeped in Catholicism and superstition and all that sort of thing. And so these monks, according to the general community, they're devoted to God. Okay. So, they would be giving sermons, there'd be, church activities, charities, they'd be giving food to the poor. I mean, these people were singing in choirs, they were ringing bells that were heard all throughout the community. So that was part of timekeeping. They had relics in these churches. There were all sorts of superstitions. It's estimated that for every monk that was in these monasteries, there was another 2 people who worked there. So you had staff there, just local people from the community who cleaned and did all sorts of things. So these, had to have 800 monasteries in the UK was a huge thing. And there were different types of monasteries as well. The Benedictines that they were. Oftentimes they had to provide for themselves, had to grow all their own food and things like that. There were different groups, the Cistercians. I'm not really sure what they did, but just a name of another group. So there were friars who took vows of poverty. So there were groups that were sort of not worried about money and things like that. They accumulated a bit of wealth, but there are others who took vows of poverty and they were always just poor. They were going out helping people. But what we see in these places, these were scriptoriums oftentimes. So they would be copying Bible manuscripts and they were doing biblical artwork, gold lining on certain pictures and letters, gold leaf illumination. So these monasteries were filled to the brim with Bible manuscripts, books like apocryphal stories, difficult scribal work. So they would have to do a book from lamb skins or goat skins or calf skins and things like that. So they would go from the ground up, so that they would have to acquire these type of things, and then they would have to get the scribes to oftentimes make their own inks and things like that. And so putting it all, like basically going from there's the cow in the paddock to, okay, here's the finished product, we've got a book now filled with different folios and we're putting that on the shelf. And so Henry VIII, he wanted a divorce, and so he issued what's called the Act of Supremacy. Now, he realized that by auditing the monasteries that they had 10 times more money than the crown, the royal family, I guess you call it. And so he got people underneath Cromwell, guys like Leighton and a bunch of others, to do a bit of a witch hunt. And what they found was a lot of these monasteries were involved with, sexual immorality. Now, this had been fueled by the writings of people like Erasmus, who grew up in these monasteries. And he said that they were places where there was all sorts of, sexual deviant things happening. And so, Henry VIII, he saw that there was a huge threat to his empire from France and from the Roman Empire, basically coming into England. So what had happened, he started to put a lot of pressure on these monasteries. He was basically going through them like with a fine-tooth comb, looking for reasons to, shut them down, looking for reasons to take their goods and things like that. And so this caused a rebellion in England, and so many rebels were executed, and hundreds of people executed over this. And the monks were blamed for this, whether rightly or wrongly. Leave that up to your discretion. But I'm pretty sure Henry VIII, to me, he reminds me of a bit of a Herod sort of character. Sometimes he's doing good things, sometimes he's doing pretty bad things. But he started to basically come against these places where formerly for many hundreds of years these places were safe houses for these monks. A lot of these monks lived secluded lives, working in scriptoriums, ringing bells, feeding people, doing religious stuff, all the stuff that we would see in a movie like Luther, lying down in front of crosses and kissing relics and all this sort of stuff. And so what happened? Well, entire libraries were destroyed. There are reports, people using manuscripts for fire, some people wrapping up fish in manuscripts at the markets. The looting was absolutely massive. So we're going to go into some of those details tonight and look at that. And so I'll just check and see what's happening in the comments section. Okay, Docky's in the house. B-Movie says the Mormons and JWs are correct. Okay. I would say that you're smoking something a little bit strange there, B-Movie, to come to that conclusion that they're both correct. I mean, they are actually at loggerheads against each other. Nexus says Revolution. Hello, Nick. Hudson's in the house. Okay, a few people apologizing, and everyone's just living the dream in the chat. So I will get this article up here. The dissolution of the monasteries. Now, what I might do is I might get some of these pictures. So these are just Wikipedia. So here we have Henry VIII. Pretty mean looking dude. So 16th century, England saw one of the greatest losses of biblical history, the dissolution of the monasteries. What was once a treasure trove of Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and even Syriac manuscripts vanished into oblivion. The very texts that Erasmus, Tyndale, and others had access to are now gone forever. What was destroyed? How does this impact our understanding of the Bible today? And so we're going to look at this massive destruction of manuscripts in England. So these monastic libraries, they were custodians of biblical manuscripts. So before Henry VIII's reign, England was home to countless monastic libraries filled with ancient biblical manuscripts. These weren't just Latin copies. Monks carefully preserved Greek, Hebrew, and early vernacular translations. We're talking about Saxon Bibles and things like that. There's a really interesting movie that I recommend people watch. It's hard to see. I tried to watch it on YouTube. There was like 10 parts, but obviously some were missing. So I think it was some of the best bits were missing. But it's called The War of the Rose. It's got Sean Connery in it. Very like it's an 80s movie, so it's a little bit daggy, but it sort of gives you a bit of a glimpse into what a monastery was like. And so basically in that story, they find a library and it's just got all the knowledge of the world from, like thousands of years ago. And spoiler alert, basically the whole tower filled with books ends up going up in flames. So they save a handful of books, but the vast majority of it just gets destroyed. Now, it's a really good movie if you sort of want to get yourself into the mindset of what's happened here. Okay. So many of these texts, they're just handwritten manuscripts. A manuscript is manus, meaning hand, and scriptum just means written. So it's handwritten documents. And many of these would date back to the early Middle Ages. So everything changed when Henry VIII broke from Rome. In a few short years, nearly 900 monasteries were dissolved, looted, and destroyed between 1536 and 1541. So you got to think Erasmus died in 1536. Okay. Actually, was it 1535? I think Tyndale died in 1536, or was it? It might be the other way around. So I just haven't got those details here. But so you're looking at Tyndale actually dying because Henry VIII wanted him to die, which is quite interesting. But you've got Erasmus dying around about that same time, and then you see a lot of these manuscripts getting destroyed. So the access that Tyndale had to these manuscripts, and Erasmus when he lived in England, is invaluable because all of a sudden they're destroyed. They're no longer in existence. So the manuscripts that they were reading, that they were examining, looking at, people today, it doesn't matter how hard they're going to look, it's probably sitting in a pile of ashes underneath 10 feet of dirt. It's just non-existent. It's a puff of smoke up there, escaping out the ozone hole somewhere. Not that I believe that. And so what happened to these manuscripts? Well, some were burned, others were sold, many were simply abandoned and left to rot in the elements. If you've got a monastery that's burnt, the roof is just completely burnt and it's just raining. Obviously in the UK, it's not the best place to stop mold and fungus and things like that. So these books would just rot. So when we look at Erasmus and Tyndale, when Erasmus compiled his Greek New Testament, the foundation of the Textus Receptus, so he had access to manuscripts that no longer exist today. He had access to manuscripts in Venice, in Rome, in Basel, in England. Now, many of these places have had many manuscripts destroyed over the years, like I was talking about the sack of Rome. And so the manuscripts that Erasmus looked at in Rome, there's a good chance that he looked at manuscripts that we simply will never know what they were. He was looking at variants. We're not sure of what the readings were, but he was examining these things. So many critics, they argue about Erasmus's sources. He only had 5 manuscripts. I've heard Dan Wallace say that. I've heard James White say he only had 6 manuscripts. Then I've heard him say, well, maybe between 6 and 12 manuscripts. I think it was Stephen Boyce said between like 7 and 10 or 7 and 11 or something like that. And then I've heard James White say he probably had access to 20. So where are they getting this information from? They're just making it up, aren't they? If their numbers are that off, obviously no one knows, and they're just having these guesses. So it's always good to qualify that as a guess, to say, okay, well, I think that Erasmus this and that, not to make a definitive claim and say, Erasmus only had 6 manuscripts, therefore the King James Bible is based upon 6 manuscripts. I've heard that frequently by critical text people, and I'm not saying top critical text people, usually just lay people who just hate you because you read the King James Bible or have a Textus Receptus position. They're trained to hate us, and so they're trained to think that we're in a cult. Just listen to James White talk about us. He's just absolutely poisonous against us. He calls us idiots and deceived and dangerous and all sorts of things. So obviously people who listen to that, they're naturally going to go, well, these people are dangerous, and so they're going to make up their mind according to what their teachers and gurus say about things. But so I've heard all sorts of different numbers, but Tyndale and other scholars, they use manuscripts that were later lost in the destruction of the monasteries. So William Tyndale, so he gave us the first English Bible translated from the Greek and the Hebrew. So he didn't finish his Hebrew edition. I'm pretty sure he got the first 5 books done. But so he studied texts that are now disappeared. Okay, they're gone. He drew from the Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament manuscripts, many of which were held in monastic libraries. It was quite interesting. I remember one time reading a quotation about Tyndale, and he said that he was actually shipwrecked at one stage, and he had done quite a lot of translating of the Old Testament. And he said he watched all of his manuscripts and documents go into the bottom of the ocean. And he said that was sort of the will of God, because he just had to start again. And he said he did it better the next time. And I was like, I guess there is that Augustinian sort of, everything's the will of God sort of thing. I know God works all things out for the good to those who love him. But it's like I do understand that we live in a fallen world. Things just can happen. And it's like, I know God, he picks up the pieces and he makes something beautiful out of the rubble sort of thing. But sometimes it can just be like, people are like, well, it's just the will of God, hallelujah. And it's like, things like the fall. And anyway, I'm sort of starting to preach a little bit. So the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts have disappeared. So it wasn't just Latin. We just think, okay, these guys were just doing Latin manuscripts. So they were copying a lot of manuscripts. But see, the thing is, a Latin manuscript tradition is a very strong tradition. Most people demonize it because it is very strongly a defense of the Textus Receptus in many places. So, the Comia Henium, people demonize the Latin and say, well, Latin bad, Greek good, case solved sort of thing, where it's good to look at everything. So many Greek biblical texts, some dating back to the early Byzantine period, were kept in monasteries only to be lost forever. Many Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament copied by Jewish and Christian scribes were disappeared as well. So John Leyland, a royal librarian, was one of the last men to see some of these collections before they vanished. He described England's monastic libraries as being filled with ancient and valuable books, many of which no longer exist. So we're going to look at some of the stats and figures of what's left, of some of these places, because some of these places kept meticulous records of what they had. And it's just like some of these places, they got like 5 left out of thousands. And so it's not just like a few little things went missing. This was a nuclear bomb in the manuscript world. And the only reason that someone would not agree with what I'm saying is because they already have a presupposition for the critical text, because they don't want to focus on anything like this. They don't want to focus on the Textus Receptus. They don't want to focus on the Reformation. They want to focus on what's happened from Westcott and Hort onwards. That's basically what they want. And so because they don't have a text during this period, their text is just simply non-existent for like 1,500 years. And I don't even think it was around, 300. But their text is all they really want to focus on. So when we're talking about these things and manuscripts going missing, like when I brought up the issue of Revelation 16:5 with Theodore Beza, we see right at the top levels of academia, people like Jan Kranz making up stories that Theodore Beza tricked himself into thinking he had a manuscript, but he didn't. And so it's not evidence, and it's like, where are you getting that? Like, I understand people saying perhaps, maybe, I do that all the time. But to make a definitive claim that that's what happened, to me, that's ridiculous. The story is just ridiculous. Like that he's just had a senior moment, a Joe Biden moment, and went, I think that was original. Or he wrote a marginal note and then tricked himself that he actually did have a manuscript when he didn't, and all this sort of stuff. So what do we lose? So imagine what insights could be gained if we had these manuscripts that were destroyed in the sack of Rome, or in the destruction of manuscripts in the UK, or in the Great Fire of London, 1666. There's so much that we would have access to, and we wouldn't have to be left with, the puzzle where we've got like, it's a 1,000-piece puzzle and we've got 100 pieces. It's like trying to piece things back together like that. So they would provide confirmation of the Textus Receptus. And so that's why critical text people don't like this type of history. They don't like to mention it. They like to say, well, we have so many more manuscripts today. We've got 5,200, or some people are still saying 5,800. So who do you trust with that? I think it's the Myths and Mistakes is like 5,200 and something. But then you listen to some of these other experts are saying 5,800. But either way, they're saying that is way more than we've ever had. Now, I understand they're talking about Greek manuscripts, but also Latin manuscripts. We've got about 10,000 Latin manuscripts. There were thousands lost during just this time here in England alone, let alone the Great Fire of London, let alone the sack of Rome, and just other incidental things that happened throughout Europe. I mean, we haven't even touched on what happened in Germany after Luther. Most of us would have seen the Luther movie or, understand what happened during that time. And the same type of thing had happened. There were monasteries that were just burnt to the ground, looted, libraries just destroyed, burnt, filled with thousands of things and just gone. So were there manuscripts supporting the readings of Erasmus that we'll never see again? Ephesians 3:9. James White said, we don't have any evidence. We kept looking and went, okay, here's one, here's another one, here's another one. And we find this evidence around. So there is evidence for this. What was Erasmus looking at that we didn't know that was so convincing to him? We see there's people who, like obviously this Byzantine school teaching is around Erasmus, but specifically those who were surrounding him. Aldus Manutius, what do we have of all of his documents? What do we have of all of Bessarian's documents? It was interesting talking to Heffin Jones about the Bessarian museum that's in Venice with, I think it was up to about 300 or 400 biblical manuscripts in that. Lorenzo Valla, his work was printed by Erasmus, so that's why we've got it. But where are all those original documents that Erasmus had? I'm not sure if we have them or not. So there's just so much that we can look at in that era with manuscripts and go, well, where's this and where's that? How many Hebrew Old Testament texts in the UK, like dating back centuries, were just destroyed? So this was not just an attack on monasticism. It was actually an attack on the preservation of manuscripts, okay? So thankfully, God is into the preservation of the words. So the words of God have been kept intact. You could destroy every manuscript on the planet right now. Just say there was some machine that just did that and just destroyed all the computers all at once, and we would still be able to have access to the word of God because God promised to preserve his words. So he can do that in a supernatural way. I mean, if you believe that God spoke and said, let there be light, and there was light, let's speak into existence things like Saturn. I mean, it's not hard to think that God can just do a miracle. He is God Almighty. He can preserve his word. If you're going to go to judgment, okay, whether you're born again or whether you're not, okay. Now, if your name, just say you go to the gate and there's, the old sort of story. I'm not sure how actually biblically accurate this is, but it's like, there's an angel there with a book, and it's like, okay, your name's not written in the book of life, or your name is written in the book of life. Imagine you're like, well, my name's Smith, and they look through and say, oh, sorry, look, all the S pages like dropped off one day and floated down and fell into the ocean, and they're all wrecked. Sorry, mate, you can't come in. Like, we would expect that God would keep good accounts. So he would be able to keep the book of life supernaturally accurate of who's in and who's out. But the strange thing is, when he's promised to preserve his word here on earth, many people don't believe that. They don't believe in the supernatural ability of God to do this. They are deistic in their bibliology. They just believe that God sort of, he preserved, or he inspired it in the beginning and just went, there you go, guys, you guys figure it out. And then people will say, well, man got involved, and that's why there's so many problems. They just put their hands up and go, what can you do about it? Where we know that God will preserve his word. But what we're looking at is many people will be looking for readings and say, well, the Textus Receptus only has this reading, or what about, this other reading here and all the rest of it. Ephesians 3:9, it just keeps coming to my mind because Jeff Riddle did a whole debate on that. So we often hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Amazing discovery, yay, Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I'm not against it. I'm like, wow, that's very fascinating, very interesting, and all the rest of it. But rarely do we ever hear the other side of the coin of these catastrophic losses of things that are very valuable in the textual community, because it sort of goes against the critical text narrative, okay? Because they want to sort of make out that, Erasmus just had a paltry, few readings here and there, and, what else could he do? He just had limited access, and Stephanus was just copying a bunch of other guys. He's copying Erasmus and the Complutensian, and he doesn't really know what he's doing. His son Henry did a collation of something, but we don't have that anymore. So Beza, what did he know? He's just like Joe Biden walking around eating an ice cream. And the King James guys, well, they just commissioned to just translate that text, and this is the type of thing that you will hear. The type of rhetoric that you'll hear from, Dan Wallace and James White and many others. And this is just what's taught by apologists nowadays against the Textus Receptus and their King James position. So the Textus Receptus was built on manuscripts that Erasmus used, and it stands as a lasting witness to the biblical tradition that once flourished across Europe. So we see the Complutensian polyglot guys, they had access to a whole bunch of manuscripts in Rome. We looked at that last time, the sack of Rome. We're like, what were those manuscripts? Where are they now? So people oftentimes just make up things. They make up stories. They try and fill in the gaps. But oftentimes this comes with a presupposition toward the critical text and against the Textus Receptus. So England had a strong tradition for having Textus Receptus readings. Okay, we even even some of these were just in versional evidence, like the Latin. So we look at Wycliffe's Bible. He has 1 John 5:7 in there. Now it does say the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It doesn't say the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. Now apparently some say the Father the Father, Son / Word, and Holy Ghost. So I'm not sure about that, but that's what I've heard. The destruction of monasteries didn't erase the word of God. So God had his particular people go into these places, extract what needed to be extracted, then these places were destroyed. It's like going into a burning house and grabbing a whole bunch of diamonds and jewelry out of the top drawer or out of the safe or something. They were just in the right place, the right time, and obviously this is part of the providence of God. They grabbed anything that was of value before it was just completely destroyed. This happened with Erasmus in Rome, 1527. This happened with Tyndale, Erasmus, and several others in the UK. Like even things like the Comma Johanneum, when we look at the British Codex. Now, I've got to look into the British Codex a bit more. There's not much information out there about the British Codex that hasn't been tainted with the completely false concept that this is the same manuscript as Codex Montfortianus. It's simply not. If you read the annotations of Erasmus, he clearly puts down what is written in the British Codex, and it's not what is in Codex Montfortianus. And so clearly we can see that it's a different manuscript. And Burgess, who wrote about 1 John 5:7, he believed that as well. There are some in the confessional bibliology groups who have read into this as well, and we're in agreement. But there's not many who know about this. And so I'm pretty certain that this manuscript was destroyed in this type of purging. So that could be a manuscript that we never, ever see again, never have access to. And so people are like, well, we just have to say it's this one here. And so we see that type of thing with the Book of Revelation, the last 6 verses of the Book of Revelation, the 136 words that apparently Erasmus back translated from Latin. So Franz Delitzsch and Tregegels, they pronounced that they'd found this manuscript, and it was obviously the one that Erasmus used. And so he didn't just change in Revelation 19 a few words when he saw homoioteuton, which is a type of parablepsis, or your eye skips a line, and sometimes when you're copying a transcript, you can do that and miss a whole entire line. It wasn't just a line, but it was 136 words. It was 6 entire verses, or sort of like half a verse and 5 full verses. And so this is claimed that they have the manuscript now. It doesn't match with what Erasmus had or said. So, and also there's many other different readings in this. So Erasmus must have back translated from the Latin there as well. The only annotation where he ever said he back translated from the Latin was in this one place in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19. He clearly says it was to do with the book. Now, that is not 136 words. That is not 6 verses. That is ridiculous to say that, because they convinced a whole generation in England that the Communionium was based upon the type of hardly any manuscripts whatsoever. And so then they've convinced a generation of people that Revelation chapter 22 verses 16 to 21 are a back translation from the Latin, and Erasmus simply lied about it. But these two stories are actually in contradiction with each other, because if Erasmus just simply back translated 6 entire verses and had no qualms about it, even though he wrote and said it was just a very few, was a small line, and it's only in his first annotations. In his second, third, fourth, and fifth, he no longer has that annotation because it got fixed. So he put it in there to let people know what he'd done. Okay. And then it got fixed, and so he no longer needed to say that. But if he was just back translating 136 words, why wouldn't he just back translate the Communionium from Latin? Why was he looking for Greek documentation? Don't these stories like come at loggerheads? How come people are saying on one hand, well, he just willy-nilly all the way through the book of Revelation just back translated all over the place, just because he mentioned this one thing in this one annotation, and he clearly said it, and said it. He wanted the reading from the Aldine print shop, who he knew. Aldus Manutius worked for him for 9 months, knew what manuscripts they had, and knew that they were working on the entire Old Testament in according to the Septuagint in Greek, and the entire New Testament according to Greek manuscripts. So he knew what manuscripts they had, and he was saying, I want them to fix that reading, and it got fixed. Okay. And when you look through that, the difference between his 1516 and his 1519, there's hardly any difference, because there's hardly anything that needed changing. But then that opens the floodgate for these critical text supporters to say, wow, Erasmus must have did this everywhere. Well, why didn't he do it at the Communionium then? Why was he why was he waiting to see this Greek evidence? And you can tell by his annotations is what he's waiting for. Now, clearly he had access to a codex called Codex Britannicus, but no longer is that around. They've falsely labeled it under Codex Montfortianus. It is simply not the same manuscript. They don't match up. They don't match up with his annotations. See, critical text people have a very hard time believing what people have written themselves, okay? So I was just reading through a thread on the Textus Receptus Academy, and it was talking about how apparently Miller, when it came to Burgon or Scrivener having a bit of a deathbed experience where he was regretful of some of the things that he changed and things like that, that this was just seen as just like, well, Miller just lied through his teeth. These guys, everyone on the Textus Receptus side is forgetful. They're liars. if they were, Pinocchios, they just had the biggest nose in town because, that just fits in with their narrative. But usually I find that that's projection, because I find that the other side, Westcott and Hort, have lied. They had this whole story about a Lucianic recension, which toppled the Textus Receptus, and there's no reason for that to have happened. It was based upon falsehoods. It was easily proven wrong, just like 20 years after Westcott and Hort. So oftentimes these guys are lying. These are the ones who are hanging around heretics like George Van Smith and all the rest of it. So I find there is a bit of projection happening there. But anyway, let's get back to what happened in the monasteries. I'll just go through some of these comments. Bryan Ross is saying, "Hi, Nick. Hope you're well. Good to see you, Brian. I've been listening to your King James videos every time they come out, on usually a day or two after they're done. And so just slogging through the printings of up to the Blaney edition. And so, yeah, it's great information. Mr. George, shalom, shalom, Romans 8:28. That must be the one that says, God works all things out for the good to those who love him. Absolutely. If you're born again, he works it all out for the good. Calvin, Tread with Fire, says, good morning, evening, brethren. A. Hannah says, good morning, Nick, guys, girls. Why do you have a picture of TurretinFan on the screen? TurretinFan. Yeah, I'm not sure about that. Hurley Billy says, morning, folks. Good evening, Nick. Okay. All right, I'll put Erasmus there. Hang on. Oops. Let's go back. We don't need that. Here we go. Here's Erasmus. Calvin says, and I've noticed that a lot of modern text critics have moved away from the so-called Lucianic recension as a fail-safe. I don't know of anyone who believes that anymore. It's just been completely debunked. But that was the main reason why people moved from the Textus Receptus. But then they proved there was early Byzantine readings. All you had to do was look at the early church writings and go, oh, there's Byzantine readings there. And that debunked their theory. But, why let the pesky facts get in the way of a good story? So they've just continued on with it, So let's look at the importance of defending the Textus Receptus. So the TR, it's built on manuscripts that Erasmus used. It stands as a lasting witness to the biblical tradition that once flourished across Europe, including England. The destruction of the monasteries didn't erase the truth. It only made it more valuable. We must defend the legacy of Erasmus, Tyndale, and the preserved Word of God. If you appreciate what Erasmus has done, like I do, then you obviously want to represent the guy honestly. Now, I'm not one of those people who just goes, well, Erasmus was a Protestant guy, but I'm not one of those who just goes, well, Erasmus was just a faithful Roman Catholic priest. He was in the middle. Now, Luther was in the middle for quite a bit of time. There were lots of people they had access to libraries and all sorts of things by being part of the group. And a lot of these guys wanted to reform from within. I don't know how, I don't think they actually envisioned such a separation, like what happened with Luther. And even with Luther, Erasmus and Luther were debating on certain things. For Erasmus just to go, okay, I'm going to join Luther. These guys were at loggerheads with certain teachings and certain doctrines. And so would you just join Luther? If you had a church that was exactly like what Luther had down the road today, would you just go and join it and go, yeah, I'm part of this group? Because I assure you there were certain things there that were weird, that were off the wall. Luther got a lot of things right, but he also got a lot of things wrong. And so the same with many of these other guys. Now, I'll just read some stats. Okay. Now think about this. It's hard to determine exactly how many manuscripts were destroyed between 1536 and 1541. So you got a 5-year period there where this happened. So there's incomplete records. However, historical accounts suggest that thousands of manuscripts were lost during this period. So here's an example. In Worcester Abbey, they possessed about 600 books at the time of the dissolution. Dissolution. Yeah, dissolution. I'm tempted to say disillusion. It's dissolution. Dissolution, yeah. Same thing. Different way of saying it. I should speak with an American accent. I'll get it right. But only 6. So you got to think there's 600 manuscripts, right? 6 are intact today. 6. So in the Augustinian Friars Abbey in York, they had a library with 646 volumes. Only 3 exist today. So that's the type of devastation that I'm talking about. Like 3 manuscripts, and there was just so much destroyed that people like Erasmus, Tyndale, they had access to these. They were reading these things. They were looking at them. If they had friends who were in these main centers of learning, they'd say, well, I've got this manuscript here with this reading and that reading. And Erasmus was writing to many people all throughout Europe. Now, you've got to understand that this happened just as Tyndale and Erasmus died. So it's very important to know the date of 1536, okay? Just as much as you think the sack of Rome, 1527, 1536, in the UK, you had a wiping out of manuscripts. You had thousands of manuscripts. Who knows how many? You go to some people's library. I remember when I visited Joseph Chambers in North Carolina, and I got a photo of me and him in his library, and it is massive. It was 3 massive rooms, just wall-to-wall books, and he said he's read every single one of them. And I wouldn't have pictured that in his house. Now, if that house burnt down, that's the last thing that I would think was in there, like this massive library. And so some of these places, who knows what was in there? Who knows who had access to them? I know I'm bringing up questions, but this is something that needs to be thought about, because even when I mentioned that, Dan Wallace says in World War II there were 1 million biblical documents destroyed. Some people bucket that. They don't like that, or they use that because Dan Wallace is he's credible apparently. They use that stat and they don't think, well, it would be similar in World War I. You go back to all, Napoleon, and a whole bunch of other things that have happened throughout history. You can see the loss of the leaking out of manuscripts has happened. There was probably hundreds and hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. And so these examples, they show us, or they illustrate to us, the extensive loss of manuscripts during this time period, highlighting that this had after Tyndale had done his New Testament, after Erasmus had done his work. So Erasmus did his last edition in 1535, and then this happened. Okay, so we're going to look at, I'm going to just jump onto the Wikipedia page. Now, if any of you guys have any comments or questions, Hilly Billy says, that's my prom photo. Eric S. is saying, g'day, everyone. Sounds like an Aussie. 1974, so close. Hey, Eric. So this is the Wikipedia page, Dissolution of the Monasteries. Now, why am I going to Wikipedia? Now, obviously, if you talk to anyone who's in academia, they're like, don't go to Wikipedia, where I find it's one of the best places to go to. Like, they're like, it's biased information. Yeah, like Encyclopedia Britannica is not biased. I mean, the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica, if you look up the Trinity there, it says, the very first line says, the Trinity is a doctrine that is found nowhere in the Bible. That's the first thing it says. It's like, who's written this? It's a Unitarian. So I'm going to have a sip of my coffee. And so I guess maybe to get some chat happening, what else is there? We've looked at the sack of Rome. We've looked at even the fall of Constantinople would have been a big one for the Byzantine manuscript era. But then we're looking at this, obviously, and then the Great Fire of London in 1666. That was huge. 437 acres of London burnt. Now, the dissolution of the monasteries, occasionally referred to as the suppression of the monasteries, was the set of administrative and legal processes between 1536 and 1541 by which Henry VIII disbanded Catholic monasteries, priories, convents, and friaries in England, Wales, and Ireland, seized their wealth, disposed of their assets, and provided for their former personnel and functions. So basically, he funded his war that he was having. Through the policy, though the policy was originally envisioned as a way to increase the regular income of the crown, much former monastic property was sold off to fund Henry's military campaigns in the 1540s. Henry did this under the Act of Supremacy, passed by Parliament in 1534, which made him supreme head of the Church of England. He had broken from Rome's papal authority the previous year. The monasteries were dissolved by 2 acts of Parliament, those being the First Suppression Act in 1535 and the Second Suppression Act 1539. While Thomas Cromwell, Vicar General and Vicegerent, I should know how to say that, but Vicegerent, I guess. Vice and Gerey, of England, is often considered the leader of the dissolution. He merely oversaw the project. He had hoped for reform, not eliminating the practice. The dissolution project was created by England's Lord Chancellor Thomas Audley and Court of Augmentation's head Richard Rich. Historian George W. Bernard argues that the dissolution of the monasteries in the late 1530s was one of the most revolutionary events in English history. So it's quite interesting because we don't hear that much about it. And even just in building up to this, I've sort of been I guess it's a bit like me talking about the Fire of London. Like, I know about it, but I haven't really studied in depth into it. But when I studied this, I was like, this is huge. This is massive. He's saying it's one of the most revolutionary events in English history, not just manuscript history, not just church history, but just English history as a whole. There were nearly 900 religious houses in England, around 260 for monks, 300 for regular canons. So a canon there is usually referred to a member of certain bodies subject to an ecclesiastical rule, I guess like friars and other people. 142 nunneries and 183 friaries. Some 12,000 people in total, 4,000 monks, 3,000 canons, 3,000 friars, and 2,000 nuns. If the adult male population was 500,000, that meant that one adult man in 50 was in religious orders. And that's quite a lot. If you think that if you saw a crowd of 50 people, one of them would be a monk, or part of the religious orders. In the end, Henry gave most of the money to supply the war. So he gutted these institutions for his war. Okay. Now, I don't want to read everything here because it goes right into depth, but I did want to check out what Erasmus had said. So one of the main reasons that Henry VIII, or one of the accusations against these monasteries was that they were places of sin, that there was lots of sexual immorality happening, all sorts of corruption. So dissatisfaction with regular religious life and with the gross extent of monastic wealth was near universal among late medieval secular and ecclesiastical rulers in the Latin West. Bernard says there was widespread concern in the latter 15th and early 16th centuries about the condition of the monasteries. A leading figure here is the scholar and theologian Desiderius Erasmus, who satirized monasteries as lax. So he wrote a book called Praise of Folly, and in it he was just talking about how some of these monks are drunk, some of them are sexually immoral, they're perverts, they're prideful, they're all sorts of different sins. As comfortably worldly, as wasteful of scarce resources, and as superstitious. He also thought it would be better if monks were brought more directly under the authority of bishops. At that time, quite a few bishops across Europe had come to believe that resources expensively deployed on an unceasing round of services by men and women, in theory set apart from the world, would be better spent on endowing grammar schools and university colleges to train men who would then serve the laity as parish priests, and on reforming the antiquated structures of overlarge dioceses such as that of Lincoln. Pastoral care was seen as a much more important and vital to the monastic focus on contemplation, prayer, and performance of the daily office. So a lot of people were complaining and saying, look, these people are just sort of going around in circles. They've got their, they're all there praying and writing, they've got their scriptoriums and they're singing songs and all the rest of it. But some of these places had so much wealth that they were like, well, people are better off with pastors being trained and to teach people. But of course, the Roman Catholic Church is a cult. And we see that obviously there were people within the umbrella of the Roman Catholic group who had a relationship with God, but were stuck in this mess that Europe found itself in. And so, thankfully, the Reformation period happened and religious freedom came to a lot of countries. But there was a lot of turmoil when this happened. And so people like Erasmus, he was just pointing out these monasteries are filled with perversion, filled with worldly people. And people were saying that they just need pastors just to teach the local people. So this sort of fueled a lot of that. Now, oftentimes we retroactively look back at people saying things, and then we see someone acting on it, and we can sort of blame Erasmus for what happened. Well, I think Erasmus clearly spoke of what he saw firsthand, and from eyewitnesses, because he knew so many priests and monks and all those different type of people. But he definitely would not want these places to be burnt down, these books to be destroyed, and all the rest of it. I can almost guarantee that Erasmus was not like that. So Erasmus had made a threefold criticism of the monks and nuns of his day, saying, number one, in withdrawing from the world into their own communal life, they elevated man-made monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience above the God-given vows of sacramental baptism, and elevated man-made monastic rules for a religious life above the God-given teachings of the Gospels. Okay. Number 2, notwithstanding exceptional communities of genuine austere life and exemplary charity, the overwhelming majority of abbeys and priories were havens for idle drones, concerned only for their own existence, reserving for themselves an excessive share of the Commonwealth's religious assets, and contributing little or nothing to the spiritual needs of the ordinary people. Number 3, the monasteries, almost without exception, were deeply involved in promoting and profiting from the veneration of relics in the form of pilgrimages and purported miraculous tokens. The cult of relics was by no means specific to monasteries, but Erasmus was scandalized by the extent to which well-educated and highly regarded monks and nuns would participate in fraud, as he thought it, against gullible lay believers. So you wouldn't say that he's just a faithful Roman Catholic. He's obviously seen some abuses in his churches, and he's like, well, yeah, these things are wrong. Now, he didn't reform as much as I would like him to, but he was definitely onto some things about relics, and he wanted people to learn the Gospels. And oftentimes when you say, Tyndale was talking about the ploughboy, Erasmus actually said that. Tyndale just repeated a lot of what Erasmus said, and England went, oh, let's have a Reformation. When you look at Luther was borrowing a lot of what Erasmus said, and it was like, well, now we're having a Reformation. Erasmus, he was a very complicated guy. Some things I don't agree with at all. Other things I'm like, man, he said some things that were very, like, he even wrote a book about how the former pope was in hell. He's burning in hell, So some of these things were just like that rocked the religious world of these days. So summarizing the state of monastic life across Western Europe, David Knowles said the verdict of unprejudiced historians at the present day would be, abstracting from all ideological considerations for or against monasticism, that there were too many religious houses in existence to view of the widespread decline of the fervent monastic vocation, and that in every country the monks possessed too much wealth and of the sources of production, both for their own well-being and for the material good of the economy. So it's a double-sided coin. I mean, when you go to Utah, I've never been. I've watched quite a lot of videos on it and studied Mormonism a little bit. I'm sure that their group generates wealth. Even here in Australia, they have tax exemption here in Australia, so they can run farms, and they do. They farm products here in Australia, and they get tax exemption because they're a religious group. But I'm sure that if they just shut the temples or the main temple down in Utah, there would be lots of, like, there would be cleaners, there'd be people who would suffer from all that. There would be all sorts of administration, there'd be all sorts of businesses that would suffer. And so that's like here, this cult, up to 900 monasteries were closed down in these 5 years. And so the community sort of relied on these for being the place where they went to for these people to pray, prayers for their dead relatives and all that sort of stuff. But look at the hand of God on this. Here you see Erasmus and Tyndale. So Erasmus has provided the Greek, Tyndale's translated it. And then you have the succession of Bibles that go all the way up to King James from that time. And there's like 3 major Bible versions done in quite a short period of time during this period. But then you see all of these superstitions leaving. It's quite amazing, really, when you think of it. So while we mourn at the whole loss of manuscripts thing, we're sort of going, yeah, well, isn't it amazing that God just wiped the slate clean? He's like, let's get rid of all these religious superstitions in this country. Let's get rid of, most of Roman Catholicism. Let's just shut down all these monasteries. Let's just shut them down, burn them to the ground. Some of them, libraries gone, documents gone. Some of them have just lost everything. And so, what are you going to do then? Well, you have to start trusting in God yourself. There's one mediator, and it's Jesus. So it's quite interesting how at times God just pulls the rug from underneath a religious group, and they're like left there naked, and they're like, well, what are we going to do now? And so I find it quite interesting, just the timing. So here's Erasmus, access to Rome, all the manuscripts there. The sack of Rome happens. That closes the door to the Renaissance period in Rome. Here we have in England, Erasmus had access. And see, Erasmus wasn't just like visiting there and like we would go to the British Library and go, oh, there's Codex Sinaiticus. We're like, can we turn a page? It's like, no, next, sort of thing. Like with that Luther movie where he's, bowing down to John the Baptist's head, we're like, we just want to stay a little bit longer. It's like, move along, where we would go to libraries and just sort of get shuffled around. But Erasmus knew, like he met Henry VIII. He knew Thomas More personally, that they were best friends. So when you've got access to the leadership, the religious leadership of a country like that, you've got access to all the libraries. And obviously this guy's a bookworm. He's not just sitting around, playing Pokemon Go. He's going, okay, well, I want to know what readings are. He's looking for variants. He's going through all the libraries. So for him to be in England, half the time he was only there to do that. And he's like, well, I guess I can teach at the same time. But in that teaching, he's met a whole bunch of other people. And so it's really the presence of Erasmus in England that stirred a whole bunch of things, because he had so much respect. And then Tyndale's coming along and just translating his works into the common vernacular. And then there's a revolution happening. And so I'll read some of these comments so I don't get too far behind. Live stream coffee, it always gets cold. Thanks for the reminder. Hilly Billy says, I keep toying with the idea of a USB, I'm not sure what that is, coffee warmer. Oh, yeah. Plug it into your computer. You can probably have the levels coming up and down, show you exactly where you're at, how much sugar's in there. Hannah, dissolution. A decomposition into fragments or parts. Disintegration, termination or extinction by disintegration or dispersion. There's a lot of big words in there, Hannah. But yeah, great definition. The military-industrial complex goes back in time, it appears. Yes. Yeah, it's an old thing. I know people think that it's a new... Yeah, I was sort of explaining the whole history of Britain and the CIA and Iran, 1953, how the CIA is basically like the Queen's personal army. And yeah, I was talking about that, but it's sort of like the British used to do it, and then they've just handed the baton to America, and they're doing it now. Maybe they'll palm it on to someone else. Maybe Australia will become a superpower. Hilly Billy says, I think you nailed it. Vicegerent. Okay. Vicegerent. Okay. Interesting. Calvin says, tried with fire. Sorry. I'm thinking of something else, but I'm reading. It says, am I mistaken in believing that a lot or most of the traditional text manuscripts came out of Constantinople and into Europe just before and during its fall? Yeah, well, you have Constantinople, 1453. A lot of scholars flee into Italy, Venice, and other places in Europe. They're there for a long time, so they establish their own little communities. People like Erasmus go and hang out with these guys. Aldus Manutius is like, let's print all these documents that you've got. You got Homer here, let's print it, So they're going through all that. And then Rome ends up with tons of manuscripts, Greek manuscripts. And they're looking all throughout Europe, looking at England. And then, so pretty much what was left of the manuscripts was dispersed throughout Europe, but then a lot of those places were destroyed by war and looting and all sorts of things. And so it's an interesting history. That period of time, from the invention of printing, like just the hand of God on everything. Here, Constantinople falls, which is like a Rome. It's a place of learning. It's the other half of the empire, Constantinople, Constantine, And then you have, 100, or not even 100 years later, 70 years later, you have the sack of Rome, maybe 80 years. And then, 10 years later, you have England with all these issues happening. So it's quite interesting. Eric S. says, sadly, Catholicism is one of the biggest still around the world, at least. Yeah, and one thing I've noticed is Sam Shamoon, Jay Dyer, these other guys are the biggest jerks I've ever seen on the internet. Like, I know you get the jerks for Jesus and you get your King James only jerks, but these guys are just so toxic. And I jumped on Jay Dyer's show the other day, and he was just the biggest jerk to me. And I asked him a question about Mary. I said, where do you get that from the Bible? And he just got mad, because I think it's just something that he knows he can't defend about Mary answering everyone's prayers. And so anyway, Catholicism is demonic. I think we really need to come more against it, because people like Sam Shamoon, Jay Dyer, I know that these guys have Catholic and Orthodox leanings, so there's sort of a bit of a mix. But these guys are becoming very, very popular. A. Hannah says, then Paul stood in the midst of Mars Hill and said, ye men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are too superstitious. Yes. Very good. And oh wow, that torture reached 6,000 degrees. You will burn your lips, Hilly Billy. And ended up in Aldus's print shop. The Greek speakers, I mean. Yeah. So that's what the Byzantine school is all about. So that's why Erasmus went to Italy. He went there to learn Greek from the Greeks. So he had learned as much as he could going through, the Greek grammars of, I was looking at one the other day, 1504, by one of the guys who actually helped him with his first edition. Because what I'm trying to do with this series is look at everyone around Erasmus. And the more that you study the people around Erasmus, like I was looking at two guys the other day, they had helped him with his editions, like his first edition of the Greek New Testament and his Latin. And then they were known as the reformers, the Dutch reformers. And so, and they were living in Basel. In 1527, they were there with Erasmus in Basel, and they were radical Protestants. So this is the thing. Like, a lot of his acquaintances and friends were involved in the Reformation, deeply involved. Like, were wanted. They should have been burned at the stake and all this. So, okay, so I'm going to just sort of skip through some of this because we don't want to read everything. But if there's anything of interest, I'll read it. Okay. Okay, so this guy with a nice long last name, in his biography of Henry VIII, he said, suffice it to say that English monasticism was a huge and urgent problem. That radical action, though of precisely what kind was another matter, was both necessary and inevitable, and that a purge of the religious orders was probably regarded as the most obvious task of the new regime, as the first function of a supreme head empowered by statute to visit, extirp, and redress. So what comes to mind is that saying, a new broom sweeps clean sort of thing. So here we have Thomas Cromwell. So he was very much involved with all this. So I'll just go down and just look at the actual sort of like sacking of these places. So we've got so much history here. Martin Luther on monastic vow. So a lot of these guys were writing against monasticism. And a lot of these guys had been monks themselves. Luther, a one-time Augustinian friar, found some comfort when these views had a dramatic effect. A special meeting of the German province in his order held the same year voted that henceforth every member of the regular clergy should be free to renounce their vows, resign their offices, and marry. So Luther just brought radical reform. And this was spreading all throughout Europe. So, yeah, when you look at when Henry was doing this, it's quite late. Like it's still in the Reformation period, but it's quite late in that period. It's almost getting into the post-Reformation period. So it says here, it is inconceivable that these moves went unnoticed by the British government, particularly by Thomas Cromwell, who had been employed by Wolsey in his monastic suppressions, and who would become Henry VIII's king's secretary. Henry appears to have been much more influenced by the opinions on monasticism of the humanists Desiderius Erasmus and Thomas More, especially as found in Erasmus's work In Praise of Folly and More's Utopia. So you got to look at Praise of Folly is written in 1511 and talks about all the corruption that was happening in the clergy then. Utopia 1516, so this is before Luther. These main guys were critical of the church. See, that's one thing to understand, is the Roman Catholic Church had become so compromised. When you watch a movie like Luther, you see the whole Tetzel thing happening, but you also see the scene where it's Cardinal Cajetan, and he's there, and they're talking about how are they going to fund, the basilica, or the building of this the basilica, and he says, John Tetzel is going to have a loan from the international bankers, and they sort of go into a little bit of detail, but not much. See, a lot of people don't realize that actual Pope in that Luther movie was Pope Leo X. These guys were Medici, so it's a bit like having someone like Warren Buffett becoming like the head of like the Southern Baptists or something. You know what I mean? It's like, who's this guy? Or he's, having, well, it's probably not a good example, but like you're having someone of that type of power and wealth and influence just becoming the leader of your church. And so it's so easy to just go, that church is corrupt. And sure, they've got a lot of artwork and they've got a lot of amazing things going on, but it's at the expense of the little people. They've lost touch with reality, and they're just fleecing these people, these hardworking people in Europe, taxing them to the back teeth so that they can fund these massive projects and art projects and the Renaissance that they're having. But these people many times were related to Medici's. The Medicis, they were the international bankers, and then they realized after they'd sort of worked out their money situation, they realized to gain power, that was through also the church. So a lot of them became it would be interesting to do a whole study into the Medicis, because they were quite influential in the Renaissance period with art. And some of these people, you wouldn't have all the art that we have today if it wasn't for these people. So even though they're, some of them are okay, some of them are very wicked, and then some of them become religious and Roman Catholic leaders and popes and bishops and cardinals and all the rest of it, just for power. So it's quite easy for Luther to say, hey, look how corrupt the church is. It's not like Luther just started preaching the gospel and everyone just got saved and they're like, wow, the Catholic Church is wrong. He's just stating the obvious. I mean, these people high up in the church are stating the obvious. So that's how corrupt it had become. It's a bit like you're looking at the Church of Scientology or something, or the Mormons. It's like, yeah, these guys, it's just really bad. You didn't have to look far. You just had to look closely, and you just see problems. Erasmus and More promoted ecclesiastical reform while remaining faithful to the Church of Rome, and had ridiculed such monastic practices as repetitive formal religion, superstitious pilgrimages for the veneration of relics, and the accumulation of monastic wealth. So that sort of repeats what was said. Henry appears to have shared these views, having never endowed a religious house, and only once having undertaken a religious pilgrimage to Walsingham in 1511. From 1518, Thomas More was increasingly influential as a royal servant and counsellor, in the course of which his correspondence included strong condemnations of the idleness and vice of monastic life, alongside his equally vituperative attacks on Luther. That's an interesting word. I'm just going to quickly look that up. Let's go to translate, detect language. Vituperative attacks on Luther. Henry himself corresponded continually with Erasmus, promoting him to be more explicit in his public rejection of the key tenets of Lutheranism, and offering him church preferment should he wish to return to England. Okay, so let's visitation of the monasteries, reports of further visitations. Okay, and so a lot of these monks were accused of being perverts, and they did a bit of a witch hunt, and they would usually classify them as, sodomites and things like that. And so it just kept getting to the point where they just wanted to, whether it was true or not. I mean, Erasmus had already spoken a lot about it, and Thomas More, but it just got to the point where it didn't really matter. They just wanted to demonize these people, whether they had done that or not, and get their wealth. And so there's probably a whole lot behind that what we could go into, but we mostly just want to look at the manuscripts. So I'm sort of just checking this page just to see if there's anything else written on these manuscripts. So I'll go to the bottom. Okay, and I'll just type in manuscript, menu. Okay, it says here, arts and culture. Along with the destruction of monasteries, some centuries old, the destruction of their libraries was perhaps the greatest cultural loss caused by the English Reformation. Worcester Priory, now Worcester Cathedral, so this was the facts that I read before, had 600 books at the time of the dissolution. Only 6 of them are known to have survived intact to the present day. At the Abbey of the Augustinian Friars at York, a library of 646 volumes was destroyed, leaving only 3 known survivors. Some books were destroyed for their precious bindings. Others were sold off by the cartload. The antiquarian John Leland was commissioned by the king to rescue items of particular interest, especially manuscript sources of Old English history, and other collections were made by private individuals, notably Matthew Parker, okay, because he did the Bishop's Bible, which is quite interesting. Nevertheless, much was lost, especially manuscript books of English church music, none of which had then been printed. Wow, that's amazing. Just the history that was just gone. Because these places were seen as like safe houses for like, okay, I've got this rare book, I'll put it in the monastery. They'll look after it. They'll copy it. They'll do things. And then it's gone, It says here by John Bale, 1549, a great number of them which purchased those superstitious mansions reserved those library books, some to serve their jakes, like toilet paper, some to scour candlesticks, and some to rub their boots, and some they sold to the grocers and soap sellers. So, imagine the bottom of a crate is a document, a Hebrew document, and they got fish on it. That's what happened. Soap and all sorts of things. Okay. So I think that's all it's saying here. So that's interesting because that was in England, Wales, and Ireland. So that's quite interesting. So I will quickly just go to, I just wanted to show you another thing about Erasmus. So I was looking on the Wikipedia page with Erasmus, and it had a nice little chart of his life. So I've noticed they've put this little info box on a lot of the issues to do with the Textus Receptus. So editors and editions, it's got, people written down there, textual influences. You can go through some of the manuscripts, notes of Lorenzo Valla and things like that. Famous readings, Johannine Comma, Principe Adulteri, etc. Modern controversy. Well, we're all labeled King James onlyists, so you may as well just get that and go Satanists. You know what I mean? We're on cultish. So they think that we're off the wall, but we've got some people there: Edward Hills, Frederick Nolan, Theodore Letus, Trinitarian Bible Society, and then translations based upon that. And so, that would be an interesting thing to check over and maybe even go onto these pages and add and subtract material as you see it needs it. Okay, so this was one thing that I wanted to look at. So we've got the birth of Erasmus around 1465. So you got to think he's born 20 years after the invention of printing, after the fall of Constantinople. So he's 20 years after that. So it's quite interesting. He's living in the Netherlands. He was orphaned. So he had his vows. He became an Augustinian monk, and he used to be a scribe, copying Latin manuscripts. That's how he became so proficient in Latin, and that's how he could do the type of textual criticism that he did, because he could spot problems in a Latin document. He would read it like we read English, and he was like, hang on, that's a scribal mistake. And he just saw these things. Then he was in France, so that's quite interesting. And then in 1505, he went to Italy for 3 years. So in that time, he was with Aldus Manutius. He was also stayed with Bombasius. You've often heard James White talk about Bombasius. Well, Bombasius was the curator for the Vatican Library after a while. So he lived with him as well in Bologna. That's how it's spelled. I don't know how you say it. I would say Bologna, but that's just the Aussie accent, I guess. So he's in Italy, but then look, he is in England. So he's in England for quite a while. So, and leading up to his in 1516 he did his edition of the Greek New Testament. So he's in England for quite a long time. Then he's in Brabant. So I'm just going to check where that is, because Brabant. Let's have a look. The Netherlands. Okay, so he's gone back over there. So that's under Pope Leo X. So, of course, you got around this time Luther and a whole bunch of other stuff happening. Then he's in Basel, 1525. So just before the sack of Rome, where all those manuscripts got destroyed in Rome, many people died. The end of the Renaissance period in Rome. And he lived until 1535. That's when his final edition came out. And that is around about the same time that they started looking at these monasteries and going, well, they've got a lot of money. Let's go through them with a fine-tooth comb, extract their money, and many of these places were looted. So all of this time, the whole lot of it, is before that period that happened in England. And so you would say that Erasmus had access while he was in England to manuscripts that are no longer in existence. Okay. You would say that when he was in Italy and he visited Venice and visited Rome, went to their libraries, looked at whatever he could, that he saw things that are no longer in Rome. They're destroyed. They're lost in history because of the sack of Rome in 1527. And who knows that, we're looking, he was in France for a long time. So that's quite interesting. And even in the Netherlands, what did he have access to in his early years? We know he read Lorenzo Valla, but, we're going to look at a lot of his other influences and things like that. And so, and then this chart here was interesting. So the cities and routes of Erasmus. So he was in Oxford and he was in Cambridge. He was also in Walsingham. Okay. London, Reading, Canterbury, Calais, St. Omer, Cambrai, Bergen, Paris, Orleans, Lyon, Turin, Bologna. So that's obviously in Italy, and it's got where he went, Oxford, Cambridge, and then he's gone to Reading. Then he's come down and he's gone off to back to Rotterdam, Mainz, Strasbourg, and then Florence, Rome, Venice. So it's interesting to try and piece together the life of Erasmus. Like, what did he do in Venice? Now, I've talked a bit about this on my website, and I've tried to bring a bit of order to where he went and what he did. So I'll just quickly go there, and we'll just see if we can read a little bit of that. Here we go. Erasmus. Okay. So, I've got, he was in Rotterdam, Gouda, Deventer, and then in Paris. So then he was in England. In 1498, Erasmus had a pupil named William Blount. He introduced him to the Cambridge Circle of English Humanists. Erasmus lived in England on 3 separate occasions and first sailed there in 1505, where he associated with Thomas More, John Colet, and Hugh Latimer. So we're going to look at all these guys and what they believed and what they thought, and all of whom became lifelong associates. He was especially impressed by Colet's new learning approach to the study of the epistles of St. Paul. Upon his departure from England, Erasmus took on the task of learning Greek to move study of the scripture beyond scholastic arguments over the subtleties of the interpretation of St. Jerome's Vulgate Bible in Latin. His longest stint was at Cambridge between 1509 and 1514. During his time there, he lectured at Cambridge and worked on his scholarly projects, including the Greek New Testament, the Greek text of the Greek New Testament. So he did a lot of that work in England. So he was there to 1514. Okay. 1509 to 1514. So before that, he was with Aldus Manutius. He was in Venice, hanging around the Greeks. Then he's gone to England. So what do you think he's going to be interested in? Greek manuscripts. He became part of English high society and met with Henry VIII. He also wrote The Praise of Folly in 1509, which was printed in 1511, while he was in England. What sort of influence did that have? Well, later on, Henry VIII is like, let's get rid of these monasteries. So then we've got the history of him in Italy, in Venice, in Basel, and other places. So I think you guys get the drift with what's occurred. And I think this is a really good thing to think about. Yeah, here's this picture again. Henry VIII. He's coming against this group for whatever reasons, whether he's right, whether he's wrong, whatever. But a lot of these manuscripts have been destroyed. So Calvin says, I thought so, and it's been quite some time since studying the history whence the majority of manuscripts came. Mary can't hear, she's dead. Yeah. Yes. But when I asked Jay Dyer, I said, how does Mary, because one of the verses that I go to prove the Trinity is that Jesus can actually answer your prayers. I mean, how can he do that? You'd have to be God to hear everyone's prayers. Like, imagine 1 million people praying at one time. How can you hear all that at one time and answer them? You have to be God, And that's one of the things that I point out, that Jesus does these things that only really God can do. But they say Mary can do the same thing, just flippantly, like, oh, yeah, she's just answering prayers and Hail Marys and all the rest of it. And I'm like, well, how can that be? And so I asked Jay Dyer, and he said, well, Revelation chapter 5 says they had bowls with the prayers of the saints. And I'm like, well, okay, is that your answer? And so then he just started teasing me because of my Australian accent. Because I said Byzantine. He's like, Byzantine, just like Sam Shamoon, you ring him up or you chat with him, and he's just like, oh, may your mother drink cat piss. And he just swears and carries on, and you just left there going, man, these guys are so toxic. Yeah, it's just amazing the support that he gets. Eric S. says, facts. I was going to talk about them bashing on Wes recently over some simple facts he got wrong on the Rogan show. He used an atheist to talk about the Fatimia Mary prophecy. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, just while we're on the subject of Wes Huff, I've noticed, like, when I do my videos, if people haven't watched my videos, they don't know what I'm talking about. And so later on, I'll mention something that was said there, and people just take it out of context, or they read into it whatever they want. And so if anyone watched my videos when I was talking about Wes Huff not knowing who Dean Burgon was, now Christian McShaffrey, he cut that little bit out and made a video on it, and I shared it, because it's a TR related thing. It's like, and a lot of people were like, just defend Wes Huff no matter what. He's a good guy, defend him. It's like, well, I'm sure atheists are saying that about Billy Carson. He's saying things that are factually wrong, and go, hang on, he's a good guy, just defend him, sort of thing. No, you should just be into the facts. I hope people do that about my videos and go, well, Nick said this and it's wrong, because then I can learn, then I can grow. It shouldn't be something where it's like, well, I'm on his team. That's my football team now, and I'm wearing his T-shirt, and how dare you speak against the team? And it's like, One of the main reasons that I pointed out that he said Cloverdale was just the fact that when we were going through and listening to him talk about King James onlyists, which were all part of this cult, according to James White, even if you just are a person on the couch reading the King James, you're a King James onlyist. Even if you're James Snap Jr., you're not a King James onlyist, but you are, according to James White. So these guys, Mark Ward, many people are holding up James White's book, and I'm like, okay, so it's like holding up the Westminster Confession of Faith and saying, this is what I believe. It's like, okay, and you're going through it, and they're like, oh, I don't really agree with that. It's like, well, have you ever read it? Have you ever read James White's book and the 5 categories of King James Version onlyists? I'm one of them, apparently. Most people who just have a TR position are one of them. If you have a majority text position, you're one of them. And so all the categories are wrong. But if you're holding that book up and saying this is where you need to go, you have to cop the ire of people who know better. It's like you holding up the Communist Manifesto and saying, I agree with this. And we're like, what, really? Did you really think this? And it's just an ignorant thing to do, but it's a trendy thing to do. People are like, oh, James White, go there. Go and look at his stuff, because I certainly can't answer it. That's what they feel. They feel obliged to just show you that book or authorize, that's where I go to. And so now Wes Huff was saying the Cloverdale Bible. Now, one thing that I was pointing out, I don't really care that he said Cloverdale Bible. I'm not a grammar Nazi. I say stupid things all the time. In this series, I probably said 10 things, places, names that are all wrong. People are just laughing, under their breath. But at the end of the day, for someone who knows or claims to be an expert on these issues, on textual criticism, he's going around saying he's an expert on these things. And then when he's critiquing King James onlyism, we're sort of looking at him going, you don't know much. And after a while, like if I was to talk to James White, I would go, okay, he knows a certain amount. Dan Wallace, he knows a certain amount. Where Wes Huff knows almost nothing. Yeah, he's just sort of reading off a sheet of paper. And then someone actually found where he had the misprint on his website. So he was just reading Cloverdale. And I'm not saying that that's like the be-all, end-all. I'm just like, that was just one fact out of maybe 20 that we pointed out. Like, gee, he doesn't know that much, does he? And then when he said he doesn't know who Dean John William Burgon is, like, we were all just gobsmacked. Now, why would we talk about that? Because, see, if he doesn't know who Burgon is, then he doesn't know the greatest person in the generation of Westcott and Hort, the greatest scholar of that era, to come against their work and basically completely destroy them. It was Burgon. And so Hoskier was okay afterwards, and Miller, he did some work with Burgon, and there were a few others. But Burgon was the main driver behind that. Now, so he doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand that it was opposition against Westcott and Hort. That's like when you're in this arena, it's almost like not knowing that America fought against Japan, but you're saying you're a modern historian. You would just know these facts, And I've had a lot of people say, well, he doesn't know King James onlyism or your TR onlyism, so of course he's not going to know who Burgon is. And I'm like, no, even just knowing about the critical text, you would have heard of Burgon, because he was against those guys. And so it's not like they just came along and they had no opposition. That was their main opposition. It's their main contender. It's like Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, or whoever he's fighting. Mike Tyson and George Foreman. You know who they fought. If you know about boxing, if you're like, okay, I'm a historian of boxing, and it's like, do you know of George Foreman? It's like, got no idea. It's like, well, he fought against Muhammad Ali. Don't you know about that? That's one of the most famous things, But see, the thing is, it's not only. See, Burgon didn't defend the Textus Receptus. he defended the traditional text. Okay, so he wasn't a TR guy, and he clearly says that in his writings. And so what happens is people think that he's a TR guy. People think Scrivener's a TR guy. They're not. These guys are not TR people. Okay. The reformers were. These people came later, and they, in certain areas, were influenced by their generation. But they had, well, Burgon had enough bullets to come against Westcott and Houghton and completely destroy them. But he was defending the traditional text, which later on, that what he was doing was the puppy feet of the majority text movement. Okay, so if you study into what the majority text movement is, Dean Burgon is there. If you read Pickering, like if I just grab a few of these books down, so this is Harry Stur's Byzantine. I wonder how many times he mentions Burgon. So this means Wes Huff has never read this book. You know what I mean? He's never looked into the Byzantine issue, which is not a King James only issue. You know what I mean? You should, if you're saying I'm an expert on textual criticism, you should know this. You know, it should just be normal to know this. But I'm going to show you how many things he doesn't know. Okay, so what was I looking up? Burgon. Burgon. Page 9, page 13, page 15, page 16, page 23, page 36, page 37, 45, 46, 48, 83, and 128. Just in this one book. And this is Harry Stur's. And Harry Stur's taught Dan Wallace. Dan Wallace is one of his students. So he's a majority text guy. Dan Wallace says all majority text people are modern-day Marcionites. He liked Marcion, so obviously he didn't agree with this guy. Now, this guy was pretty much a critical text guy, but he did show where there's lots of Byzantine readings in papyri and things like that. So let's look at his introduction and what he says. Okay. I'll just read this. Byzantine. So if Wes Huff is like, okay, I don't know the intricacies of King James onlyism or TR onlyism, like people have accused me of sort of saying, it's like, well, of course he doesn't know your stupid King James weird conspiracy stuff. It's like, well, let me finish. These guys are not King James. These guys are scholars in the field, and people should read their books. Byzantine refers to that type of text which categorizes the majority of the later Greek uncial, semi-uncial, and minuscule manuscripts of the New Testament. It is also the type of text found in the Syriac Peshitta and Gothic versions, and in the extant quotations of church fathers from Chrysostom on. This text derives its name from the provenance or origin of most of its manuscripts, the Byzantine Empire. It has, in addition to Byzantine, been called the Antiochian, after the supposed place of its origin, and the Lucian Recension, after its supposed editor. It is Semler's Oriental, Bengal's Asiatic, Griesbach's Constantinopolitan, Westcott and Haught's Syrian, and Burgon's Traditional. Other designations of the same text include von Soden and Merck's K, standing for Koine or common text, Legrande's A, and Kenyon's Alpha. It is largely the text that lies behind the Textus Receptus and the King James Version. In this book, the Byzantine text will be referred to more or less indiscriminately by the use of several of the above terms, especially those currently being used by writers in this area of study. Okay. So why is he saying this? And he mentions Burgon saying it's a traditional text. Because anyone involved with the majority text movement, which is not a TR movement, it's not a King James movement, they would usually have read the identity of the New Testament text by Pickering. Okay. Now, how many times does Pickering mention Burgon? I mean, it's probably 100 times, but so what I'm saying is he doesn't know anything about the majority text movement either. the Byzantine priority movement. He knows nothing about it because Burgon was basically the founder of that. Okay, Burgon, page 15, 52 to 53, 59 to 61, 79 to 81, 89, 86, 118, 121, 126, 128, 136 to 100. Like, there's so many. There's a whole list there. I got through about half of them. So if you know about Pickering, you know about Burgon. Inadvertently, you can't read these books without going, oh, Burgon's on every page. Who's that? You know, have you heard of Burgon? No, that means I haven't read this. I haven't read that. Books like this, so many versions. Old school book, and it has whole sections by Dean Burgon. Is it that one? Maybe it's this one. Thy word is truth. So obviously these are defending, well, some of them defend the majority text, thinking that it's the Textus Receptus. But it's got a whole section from Burgon, like maybe about 40 pages of his writing there. So there's just a few that I got on my shelf. I hardly ever buy books anymore because it's all just online. But to sort of say, well, you don't, to accuse me, like I'm just saying he doesn't know Burgon, so he doesn't know King James issues. He doesn't know Textus Receptus issues. He doesn't know majority text issues. He doesn't know Byzantine priority issues. So he couldn't really answer any of those issues, really. He can tell you a few little stats and facts, but he hasn't really studied these things, has he? If he doesn't know who Burgon is, because he's a main player. It's like you're into science. Like if you were to ask a creation scientist, what about Albert Einstein? And they were like, I've never heard of him. You just sort of like, okay. And so I'm not just having a dig at him. I'm showing that he knows hardly anything about the issue that he's trying to debunk, King James onlyism. He doesn't know much about, and that came out in those videos and other videos that he's done as well. And I went through all of his articles on the blog that he has, and I would say half of them are very easily debunked. Like, it's not even complicated. It's like, well, he's just wrong there. That's wrong. This is wrong. And so that's why I'm pointing out these things. And so not only does he know nothing about Textus Receptus defense, King James defense, and that's what people have accused me of. You've just got your bias and you're just angry at Wes Huff because of whatever reasons. It's like, no, he just doesn't know much. I mean, there's topics I don't know much about. If you were to get me to talk about Canadian ice skating, I don't know anything about that. I'd just be making it up. I'll get on Wikipedia and just, and sometimes there are topics that we have to do that. Like I've just jumped on Wikipedia with the dissolution of the monasteries because I'm learning this. This is a Byzantine school. I'm not saying I know everything and, hey, just follow what I'm saying. I'm like, well, I'll study it a bit, but we'll learn together. Where Wes is like, okay, King James is a cult, but he doesn't really know why. That's like saying, hey, Nazis are bad, but I don't know who Hitler is, or something. I'm not saying it's that bad, but it is bad because there is a whole society called the Dean Burgon Society. And it is mentioned frequently in critical text commentary. Bruce Metzger was a member, I think, just to look at them and see what they were saying. Theodore Leadus was part of that. D.A. Waite was the main guy in that. Phil Stringer, part of that. Kirk DeVitro, part of anyone who was pretty much involved with the Bible issue was involved with the Dean Burgon Society if you stood for the Textus Receptus. So he knows nothing about all that because he doesn't know who Dean Burgon is. If you've got a whole society, it's like the John Birch Society. Well, who's John Birch? You would know. So he doesn't even know about all that either. And so there's just so many, like just him saying that one thing just reveals so much. But there was another 20 things that he said, and I mentioned in my videos, that he doesn't know much. And that's fine. That's fine. Mark Ward didn't know much when he came on the scene. That's why he was like, I'm not going to talk about the text because no one knows Greek and Hebrew sort of thing. It's like, no, it's because you don't really know about textual criticism. He was learning it, and he just sort of sprout a little bit every now and then, and we'd be like, no, Mark, this is the facts, you know. And so, but that's fine. I was probably like that 20 years ago. But when I look at what Wes is saying, it's like I said, it's like listening to a toddler describe a car crash. It's like, these cars crashed together. And it's like, well, what happened? Oh, I don't know. It was very noisy. It's simplistic. It's not scholarly. And I know people want him to be the guru on this issue, but he's just simply not. There are other things that he's good at. I think what he did on Rogan was really good. There are a few things that, you know, I would want to do better, but I probably would have not done things that he did. And I'm like, yeah, that was really good. Talking about the resurrection and the cross, crucifixion, he did really well. And so I'm not critiquing that. People are like, how come people are picking on Wes Huff? Well, because he's gone on Rogan and said, go to weshuff.com. So it's like, okay, you do that. And it's like, 12 verses are missing in the woman caught in adultery story. Well, that's wrong. Let's go into it. Last 12 verses are marked, deleted. Okay. So he's got all these videos out there saying all this sort of stuff. So we have to warn people not to get involved with his bibliology. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. So it's not just because we're bitter and we're just like, oh, Wes is getting the limelight and we're not. You know, who would want the limelight? As soon as you get the limelight, everyone looks at you and they examine everything about your life. But I don't think I'm being like that. I don't think I'm being a jerk. I'm just like, well, when it comes to the TR issues and King James issues, which he did 2 programs on Cultish about, even if he didn't go on Rogan or whatever, I would have gone through them and gone, okay, well, this guy doesn't know much about what he's talking about here. You know, and I remember Donny saying that he asked Wes Huff to debate me like a couple of years ago, I think it was now, and he backed down. But sometimes I do feel like people do back down because they listen to my stuff and they're like, I don't even know what he's talking about. It's just because it's a niche field. If you become, you know, a gold jeweler and you're making rings of gold, you mightn't know anything else about politics or whatever, but you know how to make those rings. I know how to talk about textual criticism. I know the history of these issues. I've listened to all of Ehrman. I've gone through Dan Wallace's material over and over and over. Listen to James White stuff over and over and over. So it just gets to the point where it's like, I know this stuff and I can spot it when someone is an imposter. And it's like, oh, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. So for people to get angry at that, it's more so that they're not seeing what I'm seeing. So it's sort of a blight on them too. And some people have said that. They're like, well, I never really knew who John Burgon was. It's like, well, you should. If you are publicly in front of people and saying stuff about Westcott and Hort, Lucianic recension, manuscript differences and all that, you should know about Burgon. And so I think it was surprising. A lot of people in the Textus Receptus King James community were like, I don't know who Burgon is either. And it's like, well, you should. But the thing is, you're not getting invited on shows as the main guy, as the guru who knows all about this, and you're going to condemn people as being in a cult. You know what I mean? If you don't understand a group and you're already saying they're in a cult, that's a presupposition. It's not based on facts. So anyway, I'll read through some of these comments. No doubt I've stirred up the hornet's nest. Hilly Billy says, to which the clergy replied, marry? Ooh. Well, that's what I like telling Catholics. I'm like, well, you realize Joseph and Mary got together and had sex. It's what happened. The Bible clearly says that. You mightn't like it, but God does. God made it. He invented it. And they did it. Calvin says, I must say it is awesome to see God's providential hand in preserving every jot and tittle of his word throughout history, aka his story. Yeah. So it's funny because at the beginning I'm like, oh, the providence of God and this and that. And then after a while I'm like, it's the providence of God. So that's the thing, I guess. Sometimes I'm trying to fight against the Calvinism stuff in my mind, but then I'm a strong advocate for the sovereignty of God, that God knows everything. God knows what's going on. He knows the future. And he's written the book of Revelation. I think it's all future from chapter 4. And he knew this was all going to happen. And so just the specific timing of things. And it's interesting that when Moses, he was like, I want to see you, God. We've been chatting for years. I want to see your face, or I guess it was months at that time. But and God said, okay, I'll sort of skip by you and you'll see me. I think it was like the cleft of the rock. It's in that part. And he saw his back parts. He saw God's back. And it's interesting that some people have used that and said, well, even as an illustration, sometimes we only see God in retrospect. When we look back at what's happened, we're like, can you see God in this? And you can see God in the providential preservation of all those manuscripts in Rome and England, all just being put into the right hands and people reading them and looking for variants and all the rest of it. And it's like, there we go. And then they're all destroyed. It's quite interesting. It's a bit like the Jews with their temple. It's like, oh, no, we're not going to be Christians. We're going to do whatever we want to do. We don't need a Messiah. And then it's like, oh, there's no more temple. Oh, and we're kicked out of Israel. What do we do? So some of these guys are just cracking themselves up. I always thought Erasmus was the innovator of the eraser. No. Just for me or no sound? Yeah, so everyone else can hear me. I can mute mine if you feel left out. There are several paintings of Catherine Medici walking over the dead bodies of Protestant heretics in the streets of France. I believe some 70,000 were murdered in a matter of days. Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, in France, that probably was around the time of the Bartholomew Day massacre. Theodore Beza got quite involved with the politics of that. Eric S. says, any historical places the Vikings destroyed? Yeah, that would be an interesting thing to look at. I guess, yeah, looking at manuscripts that were in Northern Europe, going country to country. I mean, some of these places you find lots of manuscripts, like even in Russia. Russia is one of those places where I think, but then again, they've had that 1917 revolution there. And so that's a type of destruction there as well. So it's quite interesting. Everywhere they went, I believe the Vikings plundered the monastery centuries before the time in question here. Okay, that's a really good point, because you did have lots of people come over, and I guess they brought their own things, but they also destroyed what was there. Hilly Billy says, what if in the kingdom we find out the truth of the matter was Vikings were not really violent, they were just super clumsy. Following Truth says he was certainly in England prior to 1500 AD. And to start with, it may be taken as certain that Erasmus was in London at the beginning of December 1497. So yeah, he spent 3 times in London, 3 stints in London. Very interesting that he had so much to do with that. And so, if we look at our picture here, so you just picture Erasmus died and then all this happened. And so Erasmus had access to all these church documents and if you went to a monastery and there was 600 books, you'd just be like, just show me the Bibles. Like there might be 100 Bibles there. Like imagine Erasmus, he would spend a week there, just going through stuff and reading stuff and talking to them about different readings, and that's what he did. The Life and Lectures of Erasmus, Lecture 2. Okay, very good. All manuscripts in Rome except Vaticanus. How bizarre. Well, see, that's the thing. Even when it's like, oh, we know that Vaticanus was in the Vatican Library because it's like 1480 something. It's written in there, 1470 something. And it's like, but that is actually a later document. It's not from that time, which is quite interesting. Did they retroactively go, well, we think it's in there, I've got to look into that. But it was interesting. I was listening to Stephen Boyce talk about the Moratorian fragment, which is considered, to have the canon, but it has some apocryphal books there as well. And it's usually dated to 170. But when you look up the date, the actual date of manuscripts of that, the latest was like, rebuke me if I'm wrong, but it was like 1,000. So it's not 180. Like they've got this document. It's like they were holding it up. It's like, yep, this is 170. It's just people have said that it existed back then, but the latest copy they have of it is like 1,000. And so this is one of the first things that you learn when people learn textual criticism is about the Moratorium fragment. And I don't think, I'm looking at it going, maybe it's been altered. Yes, maybe someone just wrote a few extra books in it, I understand. Look, I want to use everything to defend Christianity as well, but we don't want to use things that are just really easily debunked. Maybe I'm not seeing something there. If I'm wrong, please let me know. So Bold as a Lion saying, yay, part 5, Live in the Dream. Life and Letters of Erasmus, Lecture 2. How far am I behind? 2 hours and 18 minutes, but that was quite a long time ago. Okay, Bold Line saying he's been waiting so long for this, waiting his whole life for this. This is the most exciting thing that's happened all week for Boulder's Line. Bold, squint until you see 2 tiny red dots. There are tail lights. Hey, Calvin, yes, it's freezing. So I'll skip over some of this chit chat because it is funny and I'm enjoying it, but I want to sort of stick to the main point. Hudson says, where's Huff's arguments are so bad? Myth vision guys are refuting him. Yeah, the myth vision guys are like really low hanging, but they're like, hey, you got it wrong here and wrong there. And hey, that's fine. He's going to make mistakes. Yeah, I would make mistakes too. And there's certain things that he knows that I don't. But I don't think it's appropriate for people to go, oh, we can, he can pull Billy Carson over the coals about Codex Sinaiticus and the Gospel of Barnabas or whatever, but we can't pull him over the coals of these things. When he's saying he's an expert on these things, he's being invited on the show to talk about these things. He doesn't know it. So we're like, well, he doesn't know much, just as much as he would say that to Billy Carson, So judge not, lest you be judged, Hilly Billy says, I know Hudson. It's a shame because the secular world sees him and thinks he's an expert. Then he can't defend his bullcrap. Then Christians look dumb. So that word there is not a swear word in Australia, just so you know. I remember when they came out with ADC, automatic drip coffee makers. Okay, so I'll skip over some of this. I'll have another sip of my coffee. Dan Wallace once said that Erasmus only had 6 manuscripts and didn't blink an eye, as if it were true, and people actually believe this rubbish, which gets parroted over and over by those like White and Wes. Yeah. Matt Singleton is in the house. Matt says, while it's true that they get a larger audience, our numbers are still growing. We've grown about 300 subscribers in the last year. Yeah, I'm nearly crossed the 1,000 mark, actually. I'll have a quick look. Excuse me. I usually sort of get one a day, so it just trickles along. But I usually just do live videos like this. Yeah. So I had 973 subscribers. So there you go. 973. So nearly 1,000. But I tend to just sort of trickle along. I do mostly live videos, which apparently is not the best thing to do. You need to cut it down into all the relevant bits, but I sort of find that when I do that, I lose momentum. If I just go live and just chat about things, usually stuff comes out. Eric S. says, think Wes will defend the Upside Down Bible. Yeah, I saw a picture. Someone's showing me a picture of the Upside Down Bible. I couldn't figure out what it was, so I just flicked off. But okay. Did you know that he visited Israel around 1925? He wrote about it. Well worth reading. Okay, so that's part of the conversation that's happening there. Pastor Brett is in the house, living the dream. Did I hear you talking about a sovereign God? Yes. Boulder's Line says, I'm loving this, Nick. You did a lot of research. Thank you. Good morning, Pastor Brett. Hilly Billy says, another Christian lie with legs of its own in the Margaret MacDonald and John Nelson Darby inventing the rapture. Yeah. I heard one pastor say, well, you know, it's related to Freemason and the Jesuits and the occult. And I was like, which one is it? You know, just because you mention these things, can you prove that? You know, but usually you just get some Anderson type movie or Texe Marrs with spooky music, and they show his face like right up close and blurred, and it's like ding dong, this guy's evil, he's a Jesuit influenced, blah blah blah, and you're like, can we just leave this guy out of it and look at what the scripture says? But anyway, Hilly Billy says, people that parrot that one have not read Margaret's vision transcript. Oh yeah, Margaret MacDonald, who apparently was 16 years old and had visions and things like that. It's quite funny when you're a preacher person and people are like, you got your ideas from Margaret MacDonald, and then other people like from Clarence Larkin, other people like from Derby, and then you look back and there was people before them teaching pre-trib rapture, and it's like, and even one guy I was reading, he spotted 6 places where Eusebius teaches a pre-trib rapture, which is quite interesting in his writings. So that's a long time ago. The whole thing about, oh, it doesn't even exist in the writings of the early church. And it's like, no, you're just listening to the wrong people. Hilly Billy says, not a snowball's chance in Hades J&D got the rapture from any of it. Irenaeus in the 2nd century. Wrapping fish with manuscripts, yeah. So I think that's about it. One thing that I thought I'd mention is I haven't really followed the election stuff much, but I did catch a few glimpses on X today of Trump signing executive orders. And so I actually said this because I know of Ron Paul's stuff from years and years ago. He was like, well, if Obama can sign all these executive orders, you can, if you become president, you can just go in and do 100 executive orders and just, you don't have to go through Congress. You know, you just become a dictator basically. And but one of them was the releasing of all the information about the JFK issue, which I thought was really good. And I think in the next few years, there's going to be a lot of information that has been held really tight to the chest of the agencies in the United States. But instinctively, we know that there's a lot going on that they cover up, the CIA, FBI, etc. I mean, here in Australia, we know about it. The CIA overthrew our government here in 1975. It's really well known. 2010, FBI had tapped every phone in Australia. It was headlines here on all the newspapers. But, I think, it just makes you wonder whether this is just a bit too late. Like, who can they incriminate now? The vast majority of those people are dead. And so what can you do? Go, well, Lyndon Johnson apparently had something to do with it. I mean, I read a really good book about the whole thing of the McMorran mine in Indonesia that the Dulles, that Alan Dulles knew about it. He was one of the only people in the world who knew that there was like one of the biggest gold, or is the biggest gold mine in the world. And the politics that Kennedy was pushing was going to cause, it wasn't favorable to him getting any money from this mine. And so some people think that he just got rid of Kennedy in order to push for this. But I thought it was interesting that Trump was doing that anyway, regardless of if it's too late or whatever. It's like, that's a great thing. So I don't know what else he did. Some of the things it just doesn't interest me. I mean, the whole thing about saying a man and a woman, it's like, I know there's places all over the world that are caught up in this, but I mean, Justin Peters and Ben Shapiro are just like, I say a woman is a woman and a man's a man, and that's become controversial. But what it does, it actually makes the conversation really shallow. It's like we should just be even just ignoring that. I know sometimes it has to be said, but it's like sometimes just not even acknowledging it is better, because now it's like, yeah, do you know a woman is actually a woman? And it's like, man, no one was having this conversation 10 years ago. just ignore it and talk about deeper things. But anyway, things are being said and stirred up again, which is interesting. And so I'll read these few comments and then I'll shut this down. So Eric S. says, if only these people read Thessalonians, they literally thought they'd missed the rapture. Yes. And my understanding is the apostasia is a spatial departure, despite what Alan Kirshner says. He says it's not a spatial departure. Well, I proved him wrong. In the Septuagint, it does use apostasia as a spatial departure. In the Assumption of the Virgin Mary apocryphal book, it uses it as a synonym for the rapture. And so it's quite an interesting way of looking at Scripture when you see that it just means a departure, the falling away, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. Hilly Billy says it's quite simple to understand if you have eyes that see and ears that hear. For verily I say to you that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which ye see, and have not seen them, and hear those things which ye hear and not heard them. Matthew 13:17. Yeah, and I think too, just on that, people say, oh, where's the pre-trib rapture? And yeah, in the Gospels or anything. Well, if you read Luke 21, it says, when these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your head, for your redemption draws nigh. Well, the beginning of sorrows would be when they began to take place. And also it says, watch and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things and to stand before the Son of Man. So you can escape all these things. That's the very last thing that Jesus said on that day, according to Matthew 21. And so it's quite interesting. A. Hannah says, I think in regards to the government agencies, they they recognize two genders. Down with the CIA, FBI, Department of Justice, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, I think that is. MICDH, there's too many acronyms there for me to know. Federal Emergency Management of America, I think it's that one. Department of Homeland Security. The only one I don't know is MIC. God bless everyone. Got to go to work. Pastor Brett says God is using Donald Trump to turn this crooked country around. He is against the LGBTQ. That's an amazing gift from God. Yes. TC, thank you, Hannah. Okay, guys, I'm going to shut this down. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in our next Revolution video. Thanks for joining us.